You probably noticed by the title in the bulletin that today we're going to deal with probably one of the most sensitive issues that we can deal with these days, and that is you and the government. It's sensitive because, as you are probably keenly aware, there is a lot of animosity, there's a lot of just downright anger, maybe even fury in the arena of politics today. And of course, we live in the state of Illinois. A lot of jokes have been passed with a bit of humor pointing out what it's like living in Illinois. And we're preparing ourselves for major increase in gasoline prices along with other fees. And we struggle sometimes with our attitude toward governmental officials. Those we agree with, we seem to be okay, but of course those that we disagree with, we think that maybe at times they're lower than dirt. And our attitudes may not be like they ought to be. Today we're going to begin looking at a passage of Scripture, chapter 13 of the book of Romans, the first 7 verses, where Paul talks about the relationship of the believer to his or her government. Some of us would think about the government this way. I saw a bumper sticker probably about 2 or 3 months ago. I don't know who was driving the car. The bumper sticker, though, got my attention. It says, "I love my country, but I fear my government." And a lot of us can share that kind of sentiment. I heard of a farmer one day was asked what were the scariest words that he ever heard in his life. And he said, "Well, the scariest words I have ever heard are these. I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Some of us can identify with that as well. We're familiar with government waste. You may, if you go back as far as the 1970s, you may remember a hammer that cost $600 of taxpayers' money. I wish I had a few of those hammers to sell, don't you? Must have been a nice hammer. And of course, hundreds and hundreds of other things. The thing that I want to alert you not to do is when you begin looking at chapter 13, one of the things that we often do is we want to take what Paul said 2,000 years ago and we want to just rush it right into our current day and think that we can fully understand what Paul is advising us to do and how to live by doing that. I want to caution you not to run immediately to application before you spend a little bit of time trying to understand, okay, Paul, what was going on when you penned this letter? What were the circumstances around it? What had taken place just prior to it? Who was the Caesar that was in control? What kind of Roman Senate was dominating? I mean, what was going on, Paul? I want to share just a few, not exhaustively, and I'm not trying to bore you with historical details, but you need to know these things. Because if you don't know these things, when you begin looking at this, you're going to maybe miss what Paul is really pointing to, which is, for us these days, pretty easy to do. There's some background. Many of the Christians at Rome, because of a lot of Old Testament allusions and quotations that Paul uses, were undoubtedly Jews. It's important that we are aware of that. Also, there's a historical detail that we need to be aware of as well. When the emperor of the Roman Empire was Claudius, he expelled all the Jews from Rome. Apparently there was some unrest in the Jewish population, and the emperor was just fed up with it, so he banished them all, forced them all to leave Rome. Among some of those that we find in the book of Acts that left Rome was Aquila and Priscilla. They had left as the Jews had been ordered to leave. There's a second thing I want to share with you about the Jews that lived in Rome. The Jews had been steeped in centuries of teaching and hope for the Messiah to come. Now, the Messiah that they were anticipating and expecting was going to be one who would come. He would rally the people. He would develop and secure an army. And he would fight against the oppressors of the Jewish people. And in so fighting, he would free them from the domination of, in this case, Rome. There was a high degree of that nationalistic spirit that the Jews still had, at least the majority of them did, in that messianic hope that they were looking for His coming. That's what they were looking for. That's what they were hoping for. Now don't lose that, because when you see a people that are looking to overthrow the government, you can begin seeing a little bit of the tension that's going to be there in their relationship to their government. By the time Paul writes this letter, apparently the Jews were permitted to return to Rome and to their homes. And Paul, probably stunning these Jews, was not concerned with Jewish independence. He was concerned about the spreading of the gospel about Jesus Christ. That statement is primary in what I'm going to talk to you about today. Above everything is the gospel. Above the nationalistic spirit that was ingrained in the Jewish people, and Paul in particular as well, he would have shared that. But politics was not what drove the Apostle Paul. As a matter of fact, what drove the Apostle Paul was the gospel. It wasn't that he was going to focus his energies on any kind of independence movement. No, he was going to focus his energies on spreading the gospel to both Jew and Gentile, everyone that he could. There's another thing I need to tell you about, just background information. Who was the Caesar when Paul wrote this letter? It wasn't Claudius. It wasn't Augustus. It was Nero. Nero reigned for 14 years and up until his death by suicide in AD 68. So up to that point, while Paul is writing this, Nero is the Caesar. And in another context, I've told you some things about Nero. Nero was a nut. And even though that sounds kind of maybe crass, that's a nice way of saying it. The man was certifiably insane. Toward the end of his reign, even more so. There was a lot of persecution during Nero's reign. What was going on? Well, Nero looked at a particular area in Rome, and he had these big plans about what he wanted to build there. So allegedly he plotted and he planned and he sent people to execute the plan where he would take this area and just set it on fire and burn it. He did. He wanted to clear out all those people, all those human vermin, get them out of there so he could build what he wanted to build in this area. So that he burned them out. Well, rumors began to spread that Nero was the one who was behind this. So Nero had to do something about that. So he began blaming it on Christians. Hey, they talk about judgment, they talk about eternal fire, and so he began a systematic persecution, at least locally, and it spread a little bit beyond that, to persecute Christians. The persecutions that he leveled against Christians were incredibly severe. So that was what was going on, and Paul, leading up to that, and by the way, both Peter and Paul died as martyrs during the reign of Nero. And that's what was going. That was the Caesar at that time. So I want to begin by focusing in on three major principles. The first one is talking about the purpose of the government, and let's look at the first three verses. Well, 1 through 3a. It says, "Everyone must submit." You notice everyone? He's speaking to Christian people. He's speaking to Jews and Gentiles. He's speaking to those who would later read this letter. He says, everyone must, not should, not ought, but must submit to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist are instituted by God. So then, the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. I'm going to pause right there. So he begins by focusing in on all Christians. Everyone, both Jew and Gentile, everyone submit, not should, not ought, but must submit to the government. So why is human government even necessary? Let me give you some reasons. Number one, or A, on the back of your notes, it says, because it is established by God. It's established by God. Government is not some human idea. If I look at the Scripture correctly, there are 3 institutions that God has ordained. Those institutions are, or simply include, begins with, the first is the family. Secondly, it is the government. And thirdly, of course, it's the church. It's the church. Those are 3 institutions, and all 3 of those have a particular purpose that they serve. Of course, the first civilizing factor in the life of a person is the family. Now, I don't want to deviate too far off my topic, but just to say this, when you begin understanding how essential the family unit is, you begin to see why the family unit is under attack. From every conceivable angle, the family unit itself, a husband, a wife, and children are under attack. It's under attack by bringing in other issues like same-sex marriage. It's under attack by cohabitation. It's under attack in hundreds of ways that we don't have time to enumerate. However, it's under attack. It's under attack. The reason is the first unit of civilization is the family. You bring a little tyrant into the world. You know that, don't you? A little tyrant. That tyrant wants his way or her way at whatever the cost is. And your job as parents is to civilize that little barbarian. You have to. You have to, because if you don't, when he gets 18, he'll kill you. Okay? And I'm not exaggerating to any major degree, maybe a little bit there, but you get the point. The family civilizes men. Do you know that? Do you know that? Even a man that, maybe a young man is pretty wild in his living, usually when he gets married, that wildness begins to fade away. That's hope, anyway. That's what it's supposed to be. Well, the second unit, of course, is the government. We can't. If there is no government, it's chaos. Every man will do what is right in his own eye, and if that is the case, be careful, because it's going to be horrible. It's going to be like the Old West. Whoever is the fastest gunslinger is the one who survives. That's what it ends up being. So the government is necessary. We are by nature lawbreakers. We are by nature needing the structure to keep us and to help us to become civilized. It's not a human idea, it's God's idea. He ordained government. Paul begins with some successive quick facts that he begins throwing out for us in these verses. He tells us there is no authority except that from God. God establishes the authority. He establishes the authority. And those authorities that do exist are indeed, like I mentioned, established by God. And thirdly, those that resist government's authority are opposed to God's ordinance. Now, we'll be coming back to that in just a few moments. A second major thing, if you B in your notes, is why is government necessary? Because rulers are to punish evil. Now, I'm going to come back to that in more detail in just a moment, but I want to kind of step back and pause for a moment. As you're looking at what I'm saying here and thinking about the words that I'm saying, you're probably beginning to think in your mind, Paul seems pretty forthright here. Everyone must submit to the governing authorities. Does that mean in everything? It sounds like it. And you may be thinking, is there any exceptions to this? Well, there are differences of opinion here. But I would say to you, well, yes, there are exceptions, and I'll show you why in just a moment. But generally speaking, we are to submit to our government. We are to submit. I was reading several commentaries and getting different perspectives on this particular passage of dealing with how Christians should respond to his or her government. And I was reading, John MacArthur is a fellow that, I really enjoy the majority of his stuff, but he actually stated in his commentary on Romans, on this passage, that the founders of the United States, what we call the founding fathers, they actually rebelled against God by declaring their independence. They did not live up to this passage. They did that, and I would just totally disagree with MacArthur on that point. However, are there exceptions? And the truth is, yeah, there are. There are exceptions. We'll give you a rule of thumb. Anytime the government requires you to do something or not do something that is clearly revealed in the Word of God, so there's a conflict there. If that is the case, don't submit. How can I show you that? Well, let me give you some examples. Go back to the book of Exodus. The Hebrew midwives disobeyed a direct order from Pharaoh to kill the baby boys, the Hebrew baby boys. They did not carry that order out. They did not submit. Daniel and his 3 friends, when they were carried to Babylon, they refused to eat the non-kosher food that was at the king's table. They would not eat what the king served. In Daniel chapter 3, Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had erected. They ended up in the fiery furnace. You're familiar with the story, I'm sure, but they refused to submit. Daniel himself, in Daniel chapter 6, refused to obey the law that would prohibit him for a period of a month from bowing down and worshiping any other god but Nebuchadnezzar. No, excuse me, it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar. It was Darius, wasn't it? He refused. He went ahead and he did the same thing that he always done. He got down 3 times a day on his knees in a window facing Jerusalem, and there he prayed. He violated the direct law of the king. Suffice it to say, we move in the New Testament. Peter and John also disobey the Sanhedrin. The ruling Jewish council told them to quit preaching about Jesus. Their response in Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, but Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. In other words, we're going to continue preaching about Jesus. Directly disobeyed a governing body. So are there times? Yes, there are times. Just briefly, let me mention this, if I may. You probably sense, at least some of you, that there's going to come a time that you're going to have to make a decision yourself. I don't know how long it'll be. Will it be a month? Will it be a year? Will it be 10 years? Will it be 30 years? I don't know. I have no idea. But the current trend that at least I see in our culture strongly suggests there's going to come a time when you're going to have to make that decision. You're going to have to make the decision whether you will submit and go along in order to be left alone, or that you will say, I will not bow to anyone but Christ. Those days can very well be closer than we can imagine. But it could very well be. Just to be aware of that. And some are coming to the place now who study these kind of things, suggesting that it's going to happen before we know it. It's going to happen before we know it. Oh, we're safe. We're safe in here. We're safe to do our church stuff. Well, maybe that will be maybe the last avenue of this encroachment, but what about a school teacher that says, no, I will not teach that stuff? What about a physician that says, no, I will not, or another healthcare professional or a nurse, I will not participate in an abortion? This is not outlandish stuff. There comes a time when it comes into conflict with what God has declared, that we are duty-bound to our God to say, no, I will not bow. But that is not yet. And that usually is, that'll be an exception to what we're talking about. And remember, Paul is writing with Nero on the throne. Nero is on the throne. Secondly, what's the intention or intentions of government? Let's pick up with verse 3b through 5. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have His approval. For government is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because He does not carry the sword for no reason. For government is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. Therefore, you must submit, not only because of wrath, but because of conscience. There's an interesting thing that takes place here. Paul begins with the first 3.5 verses. He is talking about you all. Now he is saying you. Singular. He's not talking now you all. He's now talking you singular. So I could say as an example, I can be using the word you, and I'm talking about all of you. And then I can point to John and say you. And then you see suddenly I'm not talking about you, everybody collectively. Now I'm talking about to a particular person. That's what Paul is doing now. He is talking to you as an individual. And he's telling us about our responsibilities there. So why is the government necessary? Well, it's necessary because you have to govern with laws. And by nature, people are lawbreakers. So if you do good, you don't have to worry. But if you don't, you may have something to worry about. Innate in us is a desire that we want to violate laws. We want to violate laws. You know, you may look at something, you see that sign that says 55 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour. That's a suggestion. Highway patrolmen don't look at it that way. They don't. They don't look at it as a suggestion. You may see a sign that says keep off the grass. Immediately when you see that sign, what do you have an impulse to do? Or you see a sign that says don't touch wet paint. It is so funny to watch people when you see those kind of signs that prohibit, or there's a hole that says don't, a knot hole in a fence, don't look. Above it says don't look, and watch people. Now, you know how people are. They look both ways, and they touch the paint to see if it's wet. Anyway, that's something that's part of the nature of us, and we need to be aware of that. Do well and you'll have nothing to fear. That's right. That's right. Let me go back to another one of my earlier examples. You'll see what I mean. You're going to Mount Vernon and you're trekking down through there, and you have your cruise control set at 70 on the dot. Okay? Not 73, not 75, but 70. So yeah, people are passing you. You're going down there and you're doing pretty good, and then you look in the median and there sits a highway patrolman. Now that makes your heart beat fast no matter what, even though you may be abiding by the law. But then you immediately glance down, hey, I'm okay. And even if he comes out and turns the lights on, you're probably not the one sweating because, hey, I'm not breaking the law. That's one of those people in front of me that thought the 70 was a suggestion. That's what he points out. The government also is God's servant for your good. Can you even imagine what it'd be like living without any kind of governmental structure? It'd be absolute chaos. The government has the authority to punish. If you break the law, if you do evil, be afraid, because he does not carry the sword for no reason. The government has the authority to punish. You as an individual do not. The government does. Because if we were as individuals carrying out what we believe to be justice, it would be a vigilante, no question about it. And would be doing more harm than good. Down where I grew up, if you've ever been to Silver Dollar City, you're probably aware, you see these things all around, or if you go to the music show and whatnot. There were a group of people, there's a history here, real quickly, that they decided they were going to be the group that was going to make sure there was law and order taking place in the southern part of Missouri. And they met frequently, and they would meet on a top of a hill that had been cleared off, and it was called the Bald Knob. They met up there. And this is what they would do. If a man was mistreating his wife, and they heard about it, they would make a visit in the middle of the night to that man. The first thing they would do is they'd leave a bundle of switches. You know what a switch is? Have you ever been on the receiving end of a switch? Well, anyway, they leave a bundle of switches on their door, warning them that they're being watched. If the man continued to mistreat his wife or his children, they would visit him again. But this time they would be a little more forceful. They'd go in and get him and drag him out, and they'd let him know that he was being watched. They'd beat him up. But that group that began with a noble intent did not stay noble. They began to carry the nickname Bald Knobbers. And they became an outlaw group. They began to commit crimes. Because, see, there was no one to govern them. They responded to no government. They just did what they wanted. That's what would happen. And that's why Paul is encouraging us. That's why God ordained government. And he says this, on the D on your notes, being in subjection to the government is good for conscience sake. Good for conscience sake. If you don't have a warrant out for your arrest, you can be kind of relaxed walking through Walmart. You can be relaxed. You don't have to worry about it. If you don't have a warrant out for your arrest, and a police officer pulls up behind you and flashes his lights, or turns his lights on and pulls you over because you have a tail light out or something like that, you're not sweating. You'll be nervous, I know, but you won't be sweating bullets, because you're not guilty of anything that would warrant an arrest. You see what I mean by conscience sake? Now, if you've got a warrant out for you, you're going to always be nervous, apprehensive. A number of years ago, when I was pastoring Cahokia, there was a fellow that showed up about 5 o'clock before anybody else showed up and needing some help. And we were walking in the church, just two of us in the church. He was behind me. I was walking in front of him talking. And because of the narrow hallway we were walking down. And I said, well, one of the things that we do here is, you need to go on to the police department. They'll check you out, and then we'll see if we can help you. And he said, oh, I can't do that. I said, well, why not? He said, well, I've got warrants out for my arrest. So from then on, he was walking in front of me. We traded places. You don't have to worry about it. No sweat. No sweat. Thirdly, why is the government necessary? Well, let's look at the authority of the government. You probably said, Andy, you could have quit here. You could have quit before you got here. Verse 6 and following. For this reason you pay taxes. Since the authorities are God's public servants, continually attending to these tasks, pay your obligations to everyone. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, tolls to whom tolls are owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. In other words, meet those obligations. Nobody likes paying taxes. No one does. And you probably feel that your tax burden is too high. And it may very well be, honestly. But we still are under obligation. And that's why even cheating on our taxes, we may try to rationalize that everybody does it. But hey, God tells us to do it. Not cheat, but to pay what we owe. It's legitimate to pay taxes. Jesus was cornered one time by the Pharisees and the Herodians, which is a very unique group, two groups to meet together, but nevertheless, they were going to try to trip Jesus up. This is what they said. They said, when they came to him, they said, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and you defend and defer to no one, and that you don't show partiality, but teach truthfully the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" In Palestine, Jesus' day, the tax burden was incredibly large. So they ask, should we pay or should we not pay? And this is really a clever attempt to trip Jesus up. Because if he said, well, don't pay, he's immediately in trouble with the Roman authorities. If he says, do pay, he's in trouble with the people because they think they're being mistreated by having to pay taxes. I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, they've got him, right? Jesus asked for a coin. And he said this, why don't you test me? Bring me a denarius to look at. And they brought him one. He said, whose image and whose inscription is on this? And they said, Caesar's. Jesus said, well, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. Jesus did not take the bait. He did not take the bait. I'm going to conclude with just a couple of principles for you. Just a couple. Kind of boiling this down, I want to tell you this. Number one, the first one, a Christian should be the best citizen. The Christian should be the best citizen. You should be. As a believer, you should be the best citizen that you can be of both our county, our state, and our nation. Now, there may come a time when that won't be possible anymore, but right now it is possible, and you should be. Not to deviate too far from the task, but I wanted to mention this. Part of that means vote. You may be thinking, that's coming out of left field, Andy. No, it's not. Vote. One of the most underrepresented groups on election day are Christians. You should vote. Remember I told you that the Roman government was ruled by the Emperor Nero? We don't have a government that is ruled by an emperor. Do you remember the concluding verses? The concluding statements of Abraham Lincoln's infamous speech? We are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. You are the government. I know it's a representative government. It's not a pure democracy, but you still have responsibility and you should be the best citizen. That includes paying your taxes. It includes being a law-abiding citizen. It includes praying for people in leadership, in governmental positions. It also includes carrying out your civic responsibilities. Secondly, your foremost desire, your number one commitment should never be politics. You should be concerned about politics. You should work hard as best you can to make this county, state, nation better. But it should never be first. Unfortunately, from everything that I gather from all the hoopla that we hear these days, it's first in the lives of so many people. Remember I told you about Paul? Paul would have grown up with that messianic expectation. Paul would have grown up with a desire for Jewish independence. But that's not what he was committed to. What he was committed to was the spread of the gospel. So the second thing is the Christian's desire is to be a peaceably spreader of the good news about Jesus Christ. That should be first and foremost. Listen to what Paul writes later in the book of 1 Timothy, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. First of all, then, I urge that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings, and for those who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. That's what and it's this very government that Paul is saying submit to that is eventually will execute him. But he's saying this is what a Christian's to be about. Now, just before we pray together and we in a moment sing together, I want to just encourage you. Being a Republican or being a Democrat will never get you into heaven. It won't. It's very important that you participate because you are the government. However, it's Christ. It's Christ. I can listen to some folks that I vehemently disagree with. I mean strongly, almost viscerally, I want to respond like, what's wrong with you? That you would think such a thing. But you know what? I will not have any impact on that person's life because I can't. But I can pray for them. I can pray for God to intervene, to touch their life, to open their eyes to what they're blind to help them understand that they are so way off base. Because God can do what you and I can never do. That's what Paul says, pray. Pray. But your first and foremost commitment it's got to be to Christ. To Him and to Him alone. That makes sense to you? I know sometimes that what I'm just saying is offensive to some who are very much invested in the political process, and I understand that. But the political process will never save a miserable soul like mine. Only He will. Only He can. And He is my King. Pray with me. Father.